presented you now. So yeah, it's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the Muwinina people, the traditional owners and ongoing custodians of the land that I'm speaking from today. So today I'm sharing some very early preliminary findings from some empirical research that I've undertaken around public understandings and perspectives on trust in genomic data sharing, and in particular in the context of waivers of consent. So Professor Tam just did an incredible job explaining the differences between genetic data and genomic data. So I'm not going to cover that ground again. Just to reiterate, though, that genomic data sharing as a scientific practice involves the access and use of existing genomic information for secondary purposes. So there are a number of ethical and regulatory issues that come up when we're talking about genomic data sharing, in particular in that transition from genetic data and genetic research to genomic research. So the recent occasional paper, essentially ours, outlined some of these challenges, which include, but certainly are not limited to, concerns around privacy. In particular, the blurring between some of these clinical research and commercial applications of genomic data, the collection and use in different settings and the sharing between these different settings. Also the blurring boundaries between identifiable and non-identifiable information when we're talking about genomics. So there is an increasing consensus. It is certainly still contested, but there is an increasing consensus that genomic data might have to be now considered inherently re-identifiable. And so there are implications then for how we need to treat genomic data in terms of privacy law. There are also implications for group interests when we talk about genomic information. So genomic data can identify individuals potentially, but it can also potentially identify familial relationships, and also can be identifiable of certain cultural groups. There are also, of course, various cultural norms and values and beliefs that need to be taken into account when we're talking about genomic data as well, in particular for First Nation peoples, as Professor Tam mentioned. So there's a tension here in enabling the equitable, inclusive and respectful participation and access to genomic research, balanced with this need to account for the potential for disproportionate group harms. And there are also, of course, limits, implications for consent and the limits of what consent can do in this space when we're talking about sharing genomic data, particularly in that secondary sharing for unknown ongoing future uses. How elastic is consent, is broad consent, is dynamic consent in these circumstances? And this is particularly intensified when we're talking about discretionary judgment in granting access to genomic data through a waiver of consent. And there are implications here potentially for public and participant trust. So why does trust matter? Trust is a pervasive concept in the genomic data sharing literature. It spans the empirical, the legal, the social, the computer science, the whole gamut. And in this broad literature, trust is generally positioned as being essential for encouraging public participation in genomic research, the ongoing willingness of participants to consent to sharing their genomic data, and the ongoing social license for practice and research in this space. So some of the factors that are frequently held up as most important to upholding this sense of public trust are the conditions that surround consent, the transparency of the purpose and outcomes of the research, most particularly the public benefit of such research. And in general today, I'm talking about broad research rather than specific clinical applications. And of course, the protection of participant privacy and the security of their data. But it is also important to note that trust is rarely interrogated as a normative construct in this context. It's usually invoked as a value whose meaning is assumed, as shared, and that the meaning and effect of trust are taken for granted among the audience. Now, I am not going to try and explain the National Statement on the Ethical Conduct of Human Research to this audience, but just to note that the National Statement does have an explicit normative orientation around trust. So it appears in the preamble in black and white, and it's invoked throughout the guidelines of the National Statement in various explicit and implicit ways. So given the importance of trust in the National Statement, the importance of trust in the broad genomic data sharing literature, and most particularly the importance of values like transparency and respectful and informed consent, in upholding that sense of public trust, I think it's important to look at waivers of consent, where that transparency and that agency through consent is no longer part of the equation. So waivers of consent, of course, the guidelines appear in Chapter 2.3 of the National Statement, where a Human Research Ethics Committee can grant access to data, including genomic data, without a participant's consent and typically without their knowledge either. Of course, there's a whole range of guidelines that go into decision-making around granting a waiver of consent. For today, I just want to keep in mind the guideline D, that there is no known or likely reason for thinking that participants would not have consented if they had been asked. Now, I'm just fascinated by this criteria, not least of which is because, as far as I'm aware, Australia is the only jurisdiction that asks its research ethics committees to imagine the likelihood of participants consenting and to use that imagining as a heuristic for waiving that consent. So I'd be very interested to hear in question time or down the track, if you'd like to get in touch, how you engage with this particular criteria in your deliberations. I'd really love to know more about how this works. So to begin to untangle some of these questions around trust and acceptance in genomic data sharing and the impact of waivers of consent on the sense of trust and acceptance. Over this winter, so this is very recent, very fresh research, I undertook some semi-structured qualitative interviews with members of the Australian public. So the participants were recruited through their prior participation in a quantitative survey around HRECs and genomic data sharing, and my marvellous colleague Lindsay New at Osterton will be publishing some papers on the findings of this survey next year, so do keep an eye out for that. And participants at the end of the survey were invited to leave their contact information if they would like to continue with further research. The participants in the survey were recruited along demographic quotas to achieve a broad representation of the Australian public, but for the interviews who were recruited from within that cohort, it was a convenient sample. So we had 27 interviews completed in the end. And I just wanted to note that this study was indeed approved by the University of Tasmania Human Research Ethics Committee, and I just wanted to make a public show of my appreciation there. And I think that HRECs are sometimes quite used to being publicly criticised, but not used to public gratitude. So love your work, UTAS HREC. Thank you. All right, so what did I find? As I mentioned, this is extremely early research. There's a great deal more nuance to come, but I did find in the early analysis of the data that, to my surprise, it was fairly straightforward to sort participants into one of these four cohorts around trust and acceptance. So high or low trust in high or low trust in genomic data sharing and the broad environment surrounding it, and higher or lower acceptance of the use of a waiver of consent to access genomic data in that broader environment. So let's have a look at some of the indicative quotes from each cohort. Oh, before I do, I want to note that these categorizations of trust and acceptance emerged from the interviews themselves. So it was through how the participants constructed and engaged with the concepts of trust and acceptance. I did not, for example, undertake systematic psychometric trust scales. So first we'll have a look at the high trust and high acceptance group. There we go. So I think that the benefits of it outweigh the small risks of it. Fairly straightforward, not too surprising. We'll have a look at the diagonally opposite cohort, who had lower trust and lower acceptance of a waiver of consent. I think it's just the unknown. I don't even know what you're going to be using it for. And then we'll have a look at the more apparently contradictory groups, the group that had a low sense of trust in genomic data sharing, but a higher acceptance of the use of a waiver of consent. It wouldn't stop me giving my data, but I wouldn't trust them at all. The critical thing is to be able to do the research. And then finally, the group that had high trust in genomic data sharing, but a lower acceptance of a waiver of consent. And I believe it would be a good thing and not necessarily a bad thing to share, but I'd be against the waiver of sharing that data with another party without that person's consent. So let's take a closer look at each group. For the participants who had a high sense of trust in genomic data sharing and a high acceptance of the waiver, their sense of trust was largely built around a strong sense of the importance and integrity of scientific and medical research. This was not a respect that was extended towards research in a private enterprise setting. They also had a strong sense of integrity and a sense of personal safety within the domestic governance structures that surround genomic research, both in the specific and in the broader sense. And they also had a strong sense of the integrity of the ethical review of research in Australia. So they were quite willing to accept that their genomic data might be accessed through a waiver of consent, which they saw as a positive in enabling that scientific research to occur, enabling the benefits to accrue for society. These participants had a limited sense of personal connection to their genomic data as something that had any direct impact to their lives or identity. And there were some life course implications here around aging and wanting to leave a positive legacy for their families and for their communities. For the participants who had a lower sense of trust generally in genomic data sharing and a lower acceptance of a waiver of consent, their sense of trust was far less centred around that sort of socio-political context and much more around the specific conditions of the research in question. So where genomic data sharing was involved, they felt really strongly that there were too many unknowns to be able to feel safe in this process. They wanted to know much more about the intent and integrity of the actors and processes involved. They also had a stronger sense of the lag between technological and scientific developments and regulatory constraints, and a sort of an acute sense of their place within a broad data economy and information society where data is bought, sold, and used often without our knowledge or consent anyway. These participants also had a limited sense or limited belief that HRECs would be able to adequately represent their own personal views or the views of the communities that they belong to. So for these participants, a waiver of consent presented quite a challenge, the lack of control that they had then when that lack of agency through consent was removed was quite challenging to these participants who saw that control as the only means that they had to prevent the misuse of their data, the only means to protect their privacy and protect their exposure to future risk. So the participants who had a lower sense of trust generally, and yet a high acceptance of the waiver of consent, were quite a group of characters, actually. The lower sense of trust was centred around this sense of a very limited integrity of the broad political and regulatory context, a lower expectation of the ability or integrity of HRECs. And I want to be very clear, this comes from them, this is not my view. But despite this cynicism, they had a very high willingness to accept that their genomic data might be accessed via a waiver of consent. And so this was largely based on a really strong sense of the benefit that could be gained from research using this data. They wanted to enable research and scientific practice, but also they had this very strong sense that the secondary access to their data, the unauthorized access to their data, and the misuse of their genomic data was an inevitability, that it's not something they have any control of anyway, regardless of whether they consent or not. Their view was that if somebody wanted to access their genomic data, then they would, and that there was nothing they could do about it. Another final group, the group that had a high sense of trust in genomic data sharing, but a low sense of acceptance of a waiver of consent. At first glance, these participants had quite strong overlaps with the first group I spoke about, high trust and high acceptance, in that they had a strong belief in the importance and integrity of scientific and medical research, a strong sense of the integrity of the domestic governance and ethical review environment. But a crucial difference here was that a large sense of their trust in this environment was through their sense of agency in the process of choosing to share their data or not. That choice, that consent was essential to these participants. Where they were able to choose to consent or not, participants in this group were very happy to participate in genomic research, very happy to have their genomic data shared for secondary uses. But when that waiver of consent was introduced, it flipped a 180. So that lack of control, lack of agency, lack of transparency or recourse of accountability, the violation of their expectations around agency, the violation of the expectations for respect and reciprocity in the research process meant that the participants not only were not willing to accept the use of a waiver of consent, they were no longer willing to participate in any kind of genomic research with or without their consent. And it also impacted on their perception of the overall integrity of research, researchers and regulation in this space. Now, just to think back for a moment to that guideline that I mentioned at the start, guideline D in the national statement around waivers of consent, that there's no known or likely reason for thinking that participants would not have consented if they had been asked. I did talk directly to participants about this criteria, about all of the guidelines involved in determining a waiver of consent, but this one in particular. I asked the participants what they would expect or hope that research ethics committees would be assessing when they're determining, when they're assessing this guideline in particular around the likelihood of consent. And in all of those cohorts, so from high acceptance, low acceptance, everything in between, the overall response was, please don't do that. Why is the criteria there? So just as an example quote, why try to read their mind? It doesn't make too much sense. I mean, why would you try to think about what somebody else is thinking if you can just contact them to find out? Now, of course, you know, and I know that recontact is not always possible or desirable. There is a reason waivers of consent exist. So where that contact was not possible, I asked participants again, what might
Uh-oh, we've lost Vanessa. Hopefully this will be temporary, and so I'll just leave it right now until we see if we can get her back. It's an excellent presentation. I'm hanging on her every word, so I hope she is back soon.
I think I just dropped out there. Did I drop out?
You did. Welcome back.
Oh no, what were you up to?
Oh, we lost you for a minute.
You were just about to, Vanessa, you were just about to give us your view on further view on that category 2.3.D.
Oh, so sorry about that. That's my connection's not great here. That's awful. All right, so can you see my screen again now?
Not yet. Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
Terrific. All right, sorry about that, everyone. All right, so so where I was up to, I hope this is where you were up to. That if that forewarning of the possibility of a waiver was not possible, then the participants were mostly across the board saying that the only way that they could imagine that criteria around the likelihood of consent being met was to look at proximity and alignment as the determining heuristic. So by that, they meant primarily that the secondary access, the access seeking access to the data with waived consent, was in close alignment to the conditions of the original research. So the original purpose, the research type, the same constraints, the same protections. The closer that alignment, the more confidence they felt that it might be a decision that they would have been willing to also undertake. And the further it got from those original conditions, the more strongly they felt that, that you can't make that determination, you must seek consent again. There was also an interesting expectation among some participants of close relationships between researchers, that the researchers who initially gathered the genomic data would know and trust the secondary actors seeking to access further use to that data, or that at least there would be very strong alignment in their intent, credentials and integrity. There was also an expectation that there would be an alignment in views between the participants and the HRECs when determining if data was going to cross borders. They expected that HRECs would similarly want to make sure that data was only being shared across jurisdictions with shared ideological, legal and ethical values to the Australian environment. And the final factor that the participants were felt that might have an impact here in their sense of safety in determining that likely consent was representative decision making. So where there was demographic and community representation in and around the HRECs themselves, and ideally also with direct consultation with the communities who are going to be impacted. Now, as I said, this is extremely early and preliminary findings, so I haven't gone a long way into detailed implications for regulation and for ethical review of research. But I do have a few questions that I would like to continue to think about here. And the first is just how might human research ethics committees be able to assess the likelihood of this consent in order to grant that waiver of consent, when for a not insignificant proportion of participants, it is this likelihood of consenting to genomic data sharing is directly mediated by the use of the waiver itself. So it becomes something very circular and very knotty, very difficult. I don't envy you in making this decision. There are implications here for procedural justice when we're talking about transparency, recourse, accountability, implications and that sense of violation for ethical debt, for the perception of trust in research and researchers. We know, for example, that there is an explicit obligation to uphold participant trust in research and researchers when you're determining limited consent, but that obligation is not on the page when determining waivers of consent. But I'd be really interested to hear if or how this comes into your deliberations in this space, regardless of if you think that it should be more formalised. So I'm going to leave it there. My contact information is up there. If there's anything that didn't make sense in the wireless dropping out, please let me know. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.
Vanessa, in the US, one of the key parts of completing a PhD is a live defense of your thesis in front of your committee and all comers. You would excel at that if we had that here.
That's very kind of
you. To recommend this talk to my committee. We just wrestled with the issue of waiver of consent yesterday, with my committee being equally divided with equally valid reasons on either side. Question for you. Did you gather information about where participants derived their views from? What's the influence of social media, internet information, or misinformation in informing the opinions which you gathered?
That's a really good question. These were 60-minute interviews, so we were limited and we did cover a lot. So it did come out for some participants. This is something that they did speak about. But usually in quite general terms. So for those participants who had a higher sense of trust or acceptance, they often spoke about just sort of the idea that Australia, a democratic open society, is a safe place in which to undertake this kind of research. And they compared that to other regimes that they perceived as authoritarian, for example. Other participants did speak very much about their sense of genomic data sitting within a continuum of other types of data. Not so much about where the views came from, specifically, sources of information, but certainly they were aware of this being part of a broader environment and a broader context in which data sharing and data use occurs. And so there was quite a split there, that the participants who were less accepting of a waiver were more acutely sort of interested in where genomic data sat within that broader spectrum of information.
Gordon?
Yeah, thank you, Hudson. Thanks a lot, Vanessa. Amazingly contemporary topic, and I know that Nick Zepps will be talking about consents and waivers in the next session, so will not surprise me if there could be diametrically opposed views, but I don't think so. I'm sure they'll be pretty contemporary. And I know on Friday, myself and Ian Tyndall were discussing this just yesterday about, I was asking Ian about waivers of consent, and he brought in the concept of risk, because clearly the arbitrariness of making a decision about whether anyone would say no is just, kind of balance of probabilities. However, that's not really the point or the question. The question is, Vanessa, in respect of recent data breaches, did you get any sense of how this may have affected people's views, given that, and I hopefully everyone online will understand this, when someone says in their application, we'll stick consent forms in a filing cabinet and which is kind of flimsy. do you think the data breaches will impinge upon that willingness or trust or whatever, given that we do try and store data in a remarkably secure manner, even though we can't always control that?
Yes, for some participants, certainly, not across the board. Some were very comfortable and confident in current security procedures. These were generally people who felt fairly comfortable in their lives and security within a broad social context anyway. But for some participants, certainly data breaches were salient factors. Several were named, Cambridge Analytica, for example, not so much a data breach, but a sort of ethically dubious use of data. The interviews happened just before these very recent data breaches, the Medibank breach, for example. I would have expected that to come up, certainly. Other contemporary issues did. One example that was quite surprising to me, it's not related to data breaches necessarily, but to more the broader ideological environment in which research occurs. My interviews took place just after the US Supreme Court made their announcement on Dobbs and the Roe v. Wade implications, and that was explicitly named by several participants as, marking the US as a context they did not want their data shared in. And so that was not something I was expecting, but it was really interesting to see quite disparate sort of social issues coming into the construction of these beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And Vanessa, maybe just a follow-up. I know this is about genomic data. Do you think the same applies to, sort of all personal information that's collected during research, or do you think it's specific to genomic data?
I think that's a really tricky one to answer. It was very different for different participants. Some participants thought genomic data had absolutely nothing to do with them, completely safe. It's like a toenail, who cares? But genomic data obviously can be derived from a toenail. But other participants felt very strongly this is the most essential core personal information of me. You can't get anything more personal than this. Breach my phone number, scammers call me, okay, I'll change my phone number. I can't change my genome. And so it was a really strong split there, actually, and it really did follow distinctly along those lines of trust and acceptance, that the strongest sense of trust was related to that sense of limited personal connection, and people were far more cautious when they felt that genomic information really mattered.
I think it's a great, important distinction, because I'm fairly sure, Hudson, that your committee would have dealt with the waivers of consent, as many of us do, just in relation to the collection of personal information as opposed to genomic information. I'm really interested, Vanessa, to hear that there is potentially a split there, because it does give us some hope in terms of the ability to make those decisions about the use of personal information collected. Whereas I was going to ask you, well, where do we go with this one then? Because who can tell? I'm interested. In fact, answer that one if you can. I'll just get off now.
Gordon, that's an end of thesis problem.
Yeah, fair enough. The way forward.
But it is a really difficult question, definitely, and I know that it's something that HRECs grapple with all the time, and really wanting to do the very best by participants. And I did want to say that even though participants had various levels of trust and acceptance of waivers and various sort of levels of belief in the HREC's ability to directly represent them, across the board, most participants did really strongly feel that HRECs were doing their very best, and that had their best interests in mind, just weren't always sure that their personal interests had a place on the committee itself.
Another questioner has pointed out the history of research with misconduct with respect to research involving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Yes.
And wondered whether that predicts or has implications for trust from that perspective.
I would certainly expect so. It didn't come up explicitly in these interviews. I didn't have any participants who identified as coming from an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background. Several participants did talk around broader implications for discrimination, for research misconduct, and for sort of the potential for group harm and entrenchment of discrimination and disenfranchisement. And yet, certainly, I think with more time, more in-depth interviews, and perhaps a more specifically recruited cohort, there would be a lot to say here. Absolutely, and I really look forward to hearing what Professor Pratt has to say.